joining us on the phones right now. He's the editor of quorumreport.com. It's Scott Braddock. Scott, good morning. How are you today?
It's President's Day, as you mentioned, which is a wonderful day in Austin, Texas, because most state government employees have the day off, which means very little traffic in Austin. Oh, yes. When you look at the Google map of the city, the freeways and streets are all green.
So
does
this mean that you are just going crazy now and like driving 40 miles an hour on I-35?
It's so crazy. I was able to get downtown, in 15 minutes instead of an hour and a half.
Wow, that's nuts. Hey, Scott, there's a lot that we could talk about.
Sure.
Let's first get started down in Houston. Mike Bloomberg, it seems as though he's buying a new house in Houston these days. I mean, he's in Houston quite a bit. Talk to us about just his latest appearance down there, and he received an endorsement down in Houston.
Texas is central to his strategy, and Houston specifically is central to his strategy. And look, he has decided to forego competing in the early states, as you know, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, and he's putting all his chips in on Texas, California, and the rest of the Super Tuesday states, which, we're getting ready to start voting in Texas tomorrow. Early voting would be underway today if it wasn't President's Day, I believe. And so you have a very concentrated area there of votes in Southeast Texas. Harris County is 1/5 of the electorate in Texas, which seems amazing. But if you think about the fact that Harris County is larger than, I think, some 20 some odd states, as far as population, there's a lot of votes there. And the Bloomberg campaign has been focused both in Houston and along the I-35 corridor, from the Valley all the way up to Dallas-Fort Worth. I was at this event, two events actually, in Houston late last week, where Bloomberg was the center of the attention at the big Harris County Democratic Party's fundraiser. They have a big dinner there, as these county parties do. I'm old enough to remember when they had to beg people to come speak to Harris County Democrats, and now it's the center of the universe, right, because all these Democrats are running for president. Bloomberg was there, and there was a little bit of awkwardness because Julian Castro had also been lined up to speak to the Harris County Democratic dinner there. And I think they were doing everything they could, stagecraft, to kind of keep them out of the room at the same time. Earlier in the day, you may have seen that Castro was sort of tweeting hatred at Bloomberg over these past comments that Bloomberg had made about stop and frisk, where he had talked about the idea that the only way to get the handguns away from African-American and Latino young men was to throw them against the wall. And take the guns from them, right? And so I think it was originally that they were going to speak a little bit closer together in the lineup at that dinner, and the eventual lineup was that Bloomberg would speak very early and Castro would speak last or pretty close to last. While I was there listening to Bloomberg, there were some hecklers in the crowd. At one point, a man stood up in the back and started shouting, "Bloomberg is really a Republican. He's really a Republican." And the security escorted him out. And then another woman started to shout at him something, I think, about stop and frisk. And as she was escorted out by security, Bloomberg said something like, "Well, thanks for making me feel right at home." Well, as soon as he was done with his speech there, he was whisked away to the Buffalo Soldier Museum right there in Houston, where they had about 1,000 African-American folks packed into that museum in the auditorium as they held what they called a Mike for Black America rally. Pretty interesting. Some of the people who were lined up to speak, you mentioned the big endorsement. Sylvester Turner, who's the mayor of Houston, African-American, former member of the Texas legislature for years, had said, look, he was not happy with the stop and frisk policy, and he was withholding his endorsement, I guess, until there was some apology and some acknowledgement that it was the wrong policy, which is exactly what Bloomberg said. Earlier in the week, last week, there were some comments from Bloomberg where he was asked about his comments, previously about that, and he basically said, well, it's not the way I feel now. At the event in Houston, he went a lot further. It was a lot stronger and said, I apologize. That was not the right thing to do. And so you had these African-American leaders who were saying that their endorsements were contingent on him doing that, saying that the policy was wrong and that he should not have done that. But a really impressive piece of stagecraft, as soon as this controversy came to light last week, all of this seemed to be almost ready to go. You know that I'm not real conspiratorial, Chad. However, it may be that some of these endorsements were sort of lined up ready for when this stuff would come out. One thing that a lot of people don't realize, especially about a well-financed campaign, but it's basic politics, is whenever you're going to run for office, one of the first things that you do is you pay somebody to do all the opposition research on yourself so that you have the file folder and you know what's going to come out. Those comments that had been exposed, those past comments that originated, the reporting originated with, I believe, somebody connected to the Bernie Sanders campaign, because they want people to know what Bloomberg had said about this in the past. But the Bloomberg campaign had to have that at the ready. They knew what was going to be said.
Yeah.
And so it seemed like a very well orchestrated, I would give them some credit, a very well orchestrated attempt to kind of do damage control there. How that's going to play going forward, we'll all find out together. But guess what? All of these candidates now have to start being able to prove that they can, get support from minorities. They did not have to do that in Iowa and New Hampshire. Nevada caucus is coming up this weekend, where there is a significant minority population. And, in Nevada, more Latinos. In South Carolina, more African Americans. And Biden, of course, has staked his campaign on the idea that he's the one who's going to have that appeal with those particular voters.
Yeah. The Houston Chronicle, didn't they endorse Amy Klobuchar?
Yes, sir. Interesting. They are saying she's the one who's sort of in the moderate lane that should be taken seriously here. Meantime, you have a couple of other big papers in Texas that decided not to endorse in the presidential race, even though they're continuing to make endorsements in other races. I was saying on social media this morning, it seemed a little odd that, newspapers would, decide to opt out of the most consequential and maybe absolutely controversial of the races. Either do the endorsements or don't. And I think the way that Republicans and Democrats process newspaper endorsements is different. At this point, Chad, as the talk radio listeners probably would see an endorsement from a newspaper almost as a negative at this point. You've had, going back for years, you had Rick Perry, who eventually decided he wasn't going to meet with editorial boards anymore. Dan Patrick won't do that. I don't think Governor Abbott cares that much about, who is being endorsed on the Republican side. But Democratic voters, I think not that they all, rely on that for the way they're going to vote, but I think they do take that information as one piece of data for how they're going to cast their ballot, especially when you still have a field that's kind of wide open. I mean, we started out with more than 20 candidates in this race for the Democratic Party. Of course, you and I were joking that everybody was running for president, but it has been winnowed down quite a bit, and voters are trying to figure out which way they're going to go.
Yeah, when I saw, I guess one of the Dallas Morning News article today that they're not going to endorse a candidate for president. And my initial thought was, if you have a Bernie Sanders as the nominee, who most people would consider a socialist because he calls himself a Democrat socialist,
right. Yeah.
Versus Donald Trump, who maybe you don't like if you're the Dallas Morning News editorial board, because they endorsed against, I don't think Trump got any newspaper endorsements in 2016 in Texas. So, But there is still that argument of capitalism versus Democrat socialism. To me, there's still something to endorse there, right?
Something to endorse.
If you're going to be in the endorsement business. And I bring this up because previously in the last segment, we had a listener who was asking for my endorsements of candidates, and I don't do endorsements. That's something I stay away from, and
right.
Unless it's just something that's quite obvious. Then I just don't do endorsements. But if you're going to do endorsements, it makes no sense to stay away from the big race that everyone's paying attention to.
Right. It seems like a cop-out to a lot of people. Either do the endorsements or don't. And one of the things that struck me over the weekend, I was looking at some of the Twitter activity from reporters and editors at newspapers who are trying to remind readers that the journalists, the reporters who work in the newsroom, don't have anything to do with the endorsements that are made by the editorial board. That's always been something that has confused readers about newspapers, and it does make sense. And, I can relate to that because when I worked in Houston and in other places where there are talk shows like the Chad Hasty Show or the Rush Limbaugh Show, when I was a reporter at the radio station, I would have to explain to people, well, when Rush says something, that doesn't represent my point of view. But the listener kind of doesn't separate that out. They kind of think, well, they can say, it's all the same thing. If he's saying that on your radio station, that must be the way all of you folks feel. So, look, if they're going to do endorsements, do them. It seems, like a cop-out to a lot of folks to say, well, on the one that is the most important, we're not going to do it. And, some of these editorial boards, including at the Dallas Morning News, who I respect them quite a bit, I just respectfully disagree that they had put out this sort of long, drawn-out explanation of why they're not going to make an endorsement in the presidential race. And I don't know if it's completely clear that they're not going to make an endorsement, or if it is clear whether they're going to make an endorsement in the fall for the general election. It just seems like they're steering clear of this very divisive Democratic primary.
Huh. Okay, well, let's see here. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, let's get to some statewide news.
Sure.
You have down that he's doubling down on these Senate rules.
Yeah, so the lieutenant governor had said, I think a couple of weeks ago at this point, that he was going to take a look at changing the threshold for passage of bills in the Texas Senate. This is always down in the weeds, but of course a talk radio listener audience in Texas does know about it. It used to take 2/3 of the senators who were present to pass a bill in the Senate. And the lieutenant governor, and one of the reasons that people know more about this now is because he did make it a cause, right, when he was running for lieutenant governor, that he would do away with the 2/3 rule that had been in the Senate for, I think, 60-plus years. This rule has been in place to try to create consensus among senators, and it's not just partisan. It's not just about Republicans versus Democrats. A lot of times it has to do with urban versus rural or suburban versus rural. We've seen things that have come through the Senate that maybe weren't as good for rural Texas, where they get bowled over, right, by some of the urban senators. It does happen. But the lieutenant governor had said, look, if we lose Republican senators this fall, and he doesn't have a team of 19 senators anymore, which is what it takes to bring, legislation to the floor and pass it onto the House or pass it to the governor's desk. Then the lieutenant governor said, look, then we'll just change the rules again. In 2015, when he became the lieutenant governor, he pushed to lower the threshold to 3/5, which, by the way, is the threshold that it takes to move legislation in Washington, which of course works so well. And in Texas, he's now talking about taking it down to a simple majority. Well, there were some Republican former senators who had said quite strongly in an editorial that this was the wrong way to go, and they pointed out that it's not just a partisan thing, as I said, that sometimes it's urban versus rural. Sometimes there are other interests at play, and there are reasons that you want to build more consensus in the Senate before you move forward with legislation. Over the weekend, the lieutenant governor had a letter to the editor in the Houston Chronicle in which he said that, whatever these senators have to say, I don't care about that. And he did admit that it is going to be the senators themselves in the Texas Senate who make this decision because, Chad, it is up to the senators what rules they operate under. Of course, they're heavily influenced by the lieutenant governor. But he says if we're going to move forward with conservative legislation in Texas and voters this fall decide that there should be more Democrats in the Texas Senate, that's not going to keep him from moving forward with conservative priorities.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we're still a ways away from having a legislative session, but I guess I have not seen any current senators speak out against this. Have you?
No current
on the Republican side.
Mm-hmm. On the Republican side, I haven't seen any senators do so. On the Democratic side, they did. The chair of the Democratic caucus did say this was the wrong way to go. But on the Republican side, no. Now, it's worth pointing out that none of the Republican senators at the state level have a primary election this year, which the lieutenant governor and the chairman of the Republican caucus, Paul Bettencourt from Houston, they had sort of bragged about that. They said, look, these are conservative senators. They've given conservative results to the people, and they've been rewarded with not having primary elections. At the same time, that may free them up a little bit, Chad. If they don't agree with this, then they could certainly speak out as Republicans. At this point, they don't have any reason to be afraid of the lieutenant governor. Although, and again, this is a little down in the weeds, but we're coming up on a redistricting year, and the lieutenant governor could mess with their districts when it comes to redistricting because he could not allow a redistricting bill in the Senate to move to the floor, which would mean that he would be able to have a greater say in how their districts look over the next 10 years, because if the Senate doesn't pass a version of their own map, then the maps go to what's called the Legislative Redistricting Board, and that's made up of statewide office holders, including the lieutenant governor, who then, of course, it's only 5 people on that board, including the lieutenant governor. So then he would be 20% of the vote.
Yeah.
And the short version of this would be that if there are senators who don't agree with him or who buck him on certain issues, Chad, he could have a say in drawing new districts for them where they can't even find their families in those new districts.
Wow. All right. Scott, tell people what they can find at Quorum Report.
We'll be checking what's happening with your state government in real time there. You can always check us out at quorumreport.com and get our free email alerts just by signing up there at quorumreport.com. Thanks, Chad.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate your time as always.
Talk soon.
Have a good one. That's Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. Go to quorumreport.com.